So the Lian O11 Dynamic Evo XL is here, and I have tested 14 different cooling configurations in the case, and at the end of the video I'm going to be telling you what is the best cooling configuration for the O11 Dynamic Evo XL. And when I say the best configuration, I'm not just talking about the temperatures, I'm going to be combining the thermals, the noise levels and the aesthetics in what I think is the best way to build in this case. So starting off with my test system, we've got an i7 12700K being cooled by Deepcool's LT720 at the top of the case set to exhaust. For the graphics card I'm using the Asus ROG Strix RTX 4080. We've got three of Lian Li's 140mm SL-INF Unifans, both at the bottom and at the side set to intake. And at the rear of the case we've got two 120mm SL-INF Unifans set to exhaust. So in terms of all the fans, they're all plugged directly into the motherboard and they're all running on the standard motherboard fan curves in PWM mode. The AIO pump is running in DC mode at 100%. In terms of overclocking, the only things I've done is enabled Asus's multi-core enhancement, and I'm currently running the XMP profile for the RAM. So in terms of the thermal testing, what I'm doing is a 10-minute IDA64 stability test with all the components in the system being stressed. I'm then going to record the maximum CPU and GPU temperature during that stress test. After the stress test is done, I'm going to let the PC idle for 5 minutes in Windows and record the minimum CPU and minimum GPU temperature. Now importantly, during that 5 minutes idle time, I'm running the GPU fans at 40% just to standardize this across each of the different configurations. So taking a look at our first configuration, our CPU idled at 32 degrees and reached a maximum of 72 degrees during the 10-minute IDA64 stability test. Our RTX 4080 idled at 28 degrees and reached a maximum of 62 degrees during the stability test. Noise levels were really good during this build, and the average noise levels at idle were only 34 decibels and increased up to only 42 decibels under load. So the first thing I wanted to test was removing all the dust filters. For that first configuration I had all the dust filters installed. We had one at the bottom, two on the side and one at the top. And for the next configuration I removed all those dust filters. So the only difference with removing all the dust filters was our CPU temperature under load came down by 1 degree and there was 1 decibel less noise under load. So there really was only a very slight rise in the temperatures by 1 degree with having the dust filters in place. So the dust filters that Lian Li have used in this case do seem to be pretty good. So if I was building in the case myself, I would personally leave them in. Certainly the ones at the bottom and the two at the side, if I was having the side fans set to intake and our power supply fan's going to be set to intake. If we're having the top as exhaust, I would leave this one out. But for the purposes of the rest of the thermal testing, I have just left the bottom dust filter in place and removed all the other dust filters. So the next thing that I wanted to test was seeing if we could get away with just one fan at the rear. And the main reason for testing this is with the two fans, you must have your motherboard installed in the lowest setting. And if we actually just install one fan at the rear, you're then also going to have the choice of installing your motherboard in the middle or the highest setting. So with just one fan at the rear, there was no difference to our temperatures. Going ahead and removing the second fan at the rear, our CPU temperature under load came down by 1 degree. So the fans at the rear of the case don't seem to make a big difference in terms of temperatures, and in fact actually the temperatures were slightly better with the fans removed. In terms of aesthetics, I do think they make a massive difference, and in fact the two fans was definitely my favourite in terms of aesthetics. They make this case stand out and separate it from the original O11 Dynamic Evo. So if I was building in this case, I would definitely try and get the two fans at the rear if at all possible. I think the only reasons for doing it, if you're trying to save yourself some money and don't want to buy an awful lot of fans, and these Lian Li Unifans aren't the cheapest. The other reason would be if you don't want to have your motherboard in the lowest setting, because I've mentioned having it down at the bottom setting is the only one where you're going to be able to fit two fans at the back of the case. The other reason why you might not want to install any fans, for example, if you wanted to have a sensor panel, the back of the case here would be a perfect place for it. So the next thing I wanted to test was removing the fans at the bottom. And taking a look at the temperatures, the only difference was that our GPU idled 1 degree hotter, and there was 2 decibels of extra noise at idle and 1 decibel of extra noise under load. So in terms of the temperatures, not a big difference with removing the fans at the bottom. So what this tells me is the three 140mm fans at the side are bringing enough fresh air into the case to meet the GPU's demand. And this seems to be a pretty good GPU in terms of cooling. It's got a really beefy cooler and it runs pretty cool in this case. So in terms of temperatures, not a big argument for those bottom fans, but like I said, this is going to be about aesthetics and noise as well. And in terms of aesthetics, I think the fans at the bottom really fill the case out. And when you're buying such an expensive case, I think leaving them empty at the bottom would not look good at all. So if I'm building this case, I would definitely include them. Next thing to test was replacing the three 140mm fans both at the bottom and at the side with three of Lian Li's 120mm SL-INF reverse uni fans. In terms of the temperatures, the only difference was our GPU idled 1 degree hotter, and there was 2 decibels of extra noise at idle. So again, not a big difference in the temperatures between the 140 and 120mm fans. It is important to point out that the 140mm fans should offer improved airflow, improved static pressure at lower noise levels when the fans are running at their maximum speed. And whenever I compared this in my original build in this case, I was using a 7900X, which was running much hotter than the 12700K in this case. And the fans were being controlled by Lian Li's L-Connect rather than the motherboard, and they were running at 100%. And there was absolutely a massive difference in terms of the noise levels. The reverse uni fans were so much noisier under load. The difference in this build, and I think this is the reason why the noise levels are so good, is the reverse uni fans were only running about 1200 revs per minute during the stress test, because the GPU temperatures and CPU temperatures were so well under control, the fans were never having to ramp up really loudly. And that's why there's not that much of a difference in terms of the noise levels. So this is really useful to know if you're going to be building with a really hot CPU where your fans are going to be ramping up really highly unless you adjust the fan curves. The SL-INF reverse uni fans might not be the best choice because they are going to run much louder than the 140mm fans. I think when it comes to the aesthetics, that's really up to you to judge. I think the 140mm fans really fill the case out and look great, but the SL-INF reverse uni fans look absolutely amazing because you've got the good side of the fans round the right way, giving you intake at the bottom and at the side. I think probably what is going to be the optimal configuration for this case is whenever Lian Li bring out the reverse version of the 140mm fans, that is going to give you the best looks and probably better temperatures and noise levels as well. Next thing to test was moving the IO to the side of the case and having it set to intake, and moving the 140mm uni fans to the top of the case, setting them to exhaust. As you'd expect with the IO set to intake, our CPU temperatures were much better, and they were 2 degrees lower at idle and 3 degrees lower under load. Again, bringing more hot air into the case, our GPU temperatures increased by 1 degree both at idle and under load. In general, I have found having your IO set to intake, it tends to run a little bit quieter, and this was the case here. Although there was no difference to the noise levels at idle, our noise levels under load came down by 3 decibels. Okay, so if you're going for the best temperatures and noise levels, it's fairly clear in this case, have your IO on the side set to intake, because the slight increase in GPU temperatures is really offset by a big improvement in your CPU temperatures. The only thing for me in terms of aesthetics, this did not look as good, and there's very few IOs out there that having fans set to intake on it are actually going to look good. Whereas you can get quite a lot of nice case fans and have them on the side set to intake, and having your IO at the top, you can't really see the fans that well. And in general, in terms of aesthetics, that is going to give you the better looking build. So again here, you're weighing up a slight improvement in your temperatures compared to a reasonable hit in terms of your aesthetics. Now with Lian Li's reverse SL-INF uni fans, what I wanted to test was a push-pull configuration, because we could have the bad looking deep cool fans at the rear compartment of the case and then put 3 120mm reverse uni fans on the front, having them set to intake where the good side of the fans was going to be on display. So in terms of our temperatures, this made absolutely no difference, but it did add 1 decibel of extra noise both at idle and under load. So in terms of the aesthetics, I did think this made a big improvement to the look of the build if you did want to have your IO on the side of the case. It did come at the cost, so it's a cost of extra 3 uni fans, which aren't cheap, and 1 decibel of extra noise both at idle and under load. So you're going to have to weigh all that up and decide whether that is worth it or not for you. Alternatively, you could just stick with the IO at the top of the case. Your CPU temperatures are going to be up a little bit more, your GPU temperatures will be down a little bit, but I think the build actually looks better with the I/O at the top. So the next thing I wanted to test was mounting the GPU in the vertical position. So sticking with exactly the same configuration that we've just tested, I simply turned the GPU to the vertical position. So I did use the vertical GPU mounting kit from the original O11 Dynamic Evo. It doesn't really fit in this case. I wasn't able to secure the brackets on the side fully. So there is a separate 4-slot GPU kit that you're meant to be using in this case, and the position of that might be slightly different from what I did get. Although with the GPU mounted in the kit I was using, it was well away from the tempered glass panel. So taking a look at the temperatures, our CPU ran 1 degree cooler under load, while our GPU temperature increased by 1 degree both at idle and under load. Mounting the GPU in the vertical position was associated with 2 decibels of extra noise under load. So with the I/O on the side set to intake, our GPU temperatures were definitely better in the horizontal position. So I wanted to test this again with the I/O at the top set to exhaust. So taking a look at the temperatures, our CPU idled 1 degree cooler, while our GPU was 1 degree hotter under load. In terms of noise levels, with the GPU in the vertical position, there was 1 decibel of extra noise at idle, but 1 decibel less noise under load. So in terms of the temperatures, not really that much of a difference. Up some places, down some places, but pretty much even themselves out there. So I think it really depends on the aesthetics and what you think looks better. Put your GPU horizontally or vertically, depending on what you prefer the look of, and there's not going to be that significant a difference to your temperatures. So the next thing I wanted to do was take a look at mounting the GPU in the upright position, and you can mount it in the upright position with either the I/O at the top or the I/O at the bottom. So I started off with the I/O at the bottom. We had the 3 140mm fans at the bottom set to intake, the 2 120mm fans at the rear of the case set to exhaust, and we had our I/O at the top set to exhaust. You can mount fans behind the upright GPU, but for the first configuration I left these out. So taking a look at the temperatures with our GPU in the upright position, our CPU idled 2 degrees hotter and it was 1 degree hotter under load. Our GPU was 2 degrees hotter at idle and 3 degrees hotter under load. In terms of the noise levels, having the GPU in the upright position, we had about 3 decibels of extra noise under load. So the initial results with our GPU in the upright position are not looking as good as when we had it in the horizontal position, but it is a little bit early to make any conclusions at this stage, because what I have found in the previous testing, having the GPU in one particular orientation upright with the I/O at the top or the bottom can make quite a big difference, and also the fans behind the GPU can make quite a big difference as well. And with the configuration that we're comparing with, we did have 3 fans at the side set to intake. Now what I found in the previous testing in the O11 Dynamic Evo is the fans behind the GPU want set to exhaust, because your GPU is going to be intaking from the fans at the front, and you want to take all that heat out the back of the case where it's not actually going to go up into your CPU cooler. So all I simply did was add 3 140mm behind the GPU set to exhaust. So taking a look at our temperatures, there was no difference to our CPU temperatures. However, our GPU temperatures under load came down by 2 degrees. Noise levels under load were also better by 3 decibels. So just in case you didn't believe me about having the fans behind the GPU set to exhaust, I simply flipped those fans around, having them set to intake, and reran the thermal testing. So having the 140mm fans behind the GPU set to intake, there was no difference to idle temperatures. However, our CPU temperatures under load came up by 2 degrees, and our GPU temperature under load also increased by 1 degree. We also had 2 decibels of extra noise under load. So not a big surprise to me, having those fans set to intake, we had air coming into the GPU on one side and then coming in the other side, and it's not a good recipe for moving air nicely through the case. And then that hot air from the GPU, rather than going out the back, was actually been blown up into the top, into the CPU cooler. So it's fairly clear in this case, if you're going to have fans behind the GPU and they do seem to make a good difference to the temperatures, you will want to have them set to exhaust, where the hot air from the GPU is going out the back. Now with that in mind, if we were going to have the side as exhaust, we were going to have the bottom as intake, the top as exhaust, it didn't really make sense to have these 2 rear fans set to exhaust, and actually having intake from here and here and exhaust from the top and the side might make more sense. So what I did was I simply flipped the 2 rear fans round, and the fans behind the GPU, I turned those to exhaust again. So having the rear fan set to intake, our CPU temperatures came down by 2 degrees, both in idle and under load. while this made absolutely no difference to our GPU temperatures. In terms of noise levels, this also reduced our noise levels at idle by 2 decibels. So this really just makes sense. You're going to have additional air coming in from the rear and going straight up into the CPU cooler, while a lot of the intake at the bottom has been sucked into the GPU and then out the back of the case. So in terms of airflow, this is just a nice straight passage through the case with more air going straight into the CPU cooler, so it makes sense that your CPU temperatures aren't going to come down. The only slight problem I can see with this is we don't have any filters on the back of the case, so you will be drawing unfiltered air, which is potentially going to have dust in it. So I would still recommend this configuration, but what I would do is pick up a magnetic dust filter and install it to the back where you're not going to see it. The other thing I would probably do as well, these fans look absolutely fine set to intake, but the reverse SL-INF 120 Unifans are going to look even better at the rear. So I was building in this case with the upright GPU. I would most definitely have these 2 fans at the back set to intake. I would use the reverse SL-INF Unifans, and I would pick up an aftermarket dust filter for the rear of the case. So the last thing I wanted to test was keeping the GPU in the upright position, but turning it round so the I/O was now at the top instead of being at the bottom, and I kept everything else the same, the fans behind the GPU set to exhaust, and our rear fans set to intake. So with our GPU in the upright position with the I/O at the top, there was no difference to our idle temperatures, although our CPU temperature under load came down by 1 degree, and our GPU temperature under load increased by 2 degrees. So in terms of the temperatures and noise, there's not a big difference depending on whether you have the GPU upright with the I/O at the top or at the bottom. And this was very different to what I found in the original O11 Dynamic Evo. The Strix 3080 card that I used, the I/O at the top, it overheated. With the I/O at the bottom, I actually got the best temperatures in the case. So it's going to vary quite a bit, probably depend on the graphics card you're using. With this Strix 3080, there's not that much of a difference in terms of noise and temperatures. Where there is a massive difference, and this isn't going to be card dependent, is in the aesthetics. And I think with the I/O at the bottom, it just does not look good at all. Whereas the I/O at the top, it actually looks pretty good. And the reason for that, with the I/O at the bottom, you can see all of the upright GPU bracket on display, and you can't actually see all of the graphics card. Turn it around the other way, and actually the upright GPU bracket is hidden nicely at the top, and you can see all of your graphics card. And it is important to say, whenever I did have the I/O at the bottom, I did install the graphics card as far down as I possibly could, and still you weren't able to see very much of the graphics card, but had all of the bracket on display. So for me, unless your graphics card is really unhappy in one of these positions, I would most definitely be installing this with the I/O at the top, because it just looks so much better. So now what I want to do is compare our best cooling configuration with the GPU horizontal, the GPU vertical, and the GPU upright. So take a look at the results here. In terms of temperature and noise, the clear winner is having your GPU horizontal. And this was the configuration where I had the I/O on the side set to intake. We had intake fans at the bottom and exhaust fans at the rear and the top. So the other big advantage of mounting your graphics card in the horizontal position is you're going to save yourself quite a bit of money. The vertical GPU kit isn't going to be cheap, and the upright GPU kit is going to be even more expensive because you're going to need to get yourself a bracket and also the really long 900mm riser cable. And in fact, actually, when you can get better temperatures and better noise levels with your GPU in the horizontal position, providing you like the aesthetics of it in this position, this is probably the easier and cheaper option to go with. Now, it really depends on what you think are the best in terms of aesthetics, because certainly there is no arguing with the GPU in the upright position. It does look pretty stunning, although some people will love this, others will hate it. The fact that you can still see the riser cable, obviously I've built with a black motherboard. With a white motherboard, the riser cable in this position looks so much better. For me, in terms of aesthetics, I do think having the GPU in the vertical position looks the best. It is going to cost you a little bit extra money. The temperature and noise levels aren't going to be quite as good as the horizontal position, but for me, that's a small sacrifice to make in terms of having the best looking aesthetics, in my particular opinion. The other thing for me in terms of aesthetics, I have shown that having your I/O at the side set to intake is going to give you the best combination of CPU and GPU temperatures compared to having the I/O at the top set to exhaust. The downside of this, as I've mentioned, is going to come in terms of aesthetics. I just don't think the tubes running to the side of the case look as well as the tubes going to the top. And again, I think the only way that you can pull it off that acceptably in terms of aesthetics for me is to install those reverse uni fans on the radiator set to intake, because the fans that come with the AIO are really just not going to cut it, whereas at the top of the case you can't really see the fans and you can get away with having them there. So there is going to be a significant extra cost to those few degrees saved in temperature. So to be perfectly honest, if I was building in this case, I build mostly for aesthetics. And for me, the configuration that I would go with was I would have the graphics card in the vertical position because I think that looks the best. I would just stick to having the I/O at the top of the case set to exhaust, because the few degrees that I am going to save by having it at the side are going to cost too much in terms of aesthetics for my personal liking. So AIO at the top set to exhaust, 3 fans at the bottom set to intake, 3 fans at the side set to intake, and the 2 fans at the back of the case set to exhaust would be the configuration that I would personally go for building in this case. But again, I've given you all the information to make up your own mind on what you think is the best cooling configuration for this case. Because like I said, it depends on the temperatures, the noise and the aesthetics and what is most important for you. A few other things to point out, I have tested this with a 360mm AIO. It is possible to fit a 420 in, I just didn't have one on hand to do the testing with. And it shouldn't really make any difference to the trends that I'm getting with the results. The only thing you might notice is your CPU temperatures are likely to be even lower compared to what I've shown, but I would expect the same relationships to the different configurations depending on how you move the hardware about. The other thing that I haven't covered in the case is air cooling, and the reason I haven't done that is I think this case is mainly geared for water cooling. If you did want to go with an air cooler, it can accommodate a pretty large air cooler, and the configuration that I would go with is having the fans at the bottom and the side set to intake. Bottom fans for intake, bringing fresh air to your GPU. Side fans bringing that air to the front of your CPU cooler. You're going to want to have the fans at the rear as exhaust, taking that hot air away from the CPU cooler. And really at the top of the case, it probably doesn't matter so much what you do. Probably you can actually get away with no fans at the top, but if you're going to have fans at the top, I like to have all 3 of them matching in terms of aesthetics, and I would have them set to exhaust. Again, you won't probably get a big benefit from those fans at the top of the case. So hopefully you have found this video useful, and hopefully you can understand why I haven't come up with the best cooling configuration overall. There hasn't been an awful lot in terms of temperatures between them, and really it depends on what is most important for you. If it is the thermals, if it is the noise levels, or if it is the aesthetics. And again, aesthetics is so subjective. Everybody has their own opinion of what looks good. But in doing this video, hopefully I've given you an idea of how you want to build in the case and give you a bit of a look of each of these different configurations, and that'll hopefully help you decide what looks good and what doesn't. If you are thinking of doing a build in the case, I have done a full step-by-step build guide. It's really long. It took me about half an hour to go through all the case's features. So if you are going to want to build in this case, you are definitely going to want to check that out. And I'll put a link to that video in the description. If you have enjoyed this video, please remember to give it a thumbs up. And if you're not currently subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscribe button as well. Thanks for watching.